Well, everybody, welcome to Medicine and Science. I'm Nick Pallavita. I will be your moderator for today's program. And today's program, we're going to discuss a very interesting group, which somebody told me about, which I didn't know too much, except now I'm starting to look them up. And it's called it's an interesting name, Physicians for Informed Consent. Now, I did go through all their material, including their website, and made my own self-proclaimed determination that many, if not all, these people that are involved are not objective. They have an axe to grind. And so we're going to start with the leader of this group. And this is the leader's story. You'll love this story. On June 30th, 2015, I was blindsided by California SB 277, which was signed into law. The law, quote, removed the personal belief and religious exemptions to vaccines for both private and public school attendance. In English, what the law did is said you can't just go into public school and private school and have a disease and say, hey, that's okay, when everybody knows these are petri dishes for infections. But she, in her own determination, said she was appalled that there would be mandates that prevented this from taking place. She was shocked, by the way, and devastated. While I was busy taking care of my patients, my young children, legislators, quote, voted away my ability to protect my children, voted away my fundamental rights. I don't think parents should ever be bullied into coerced to take a vaccine, even though the kids have to mix with other kids. I'm adding that to her statement. There are children against their own judgment. As both a mom and physician, I felt compelled to raise awareness about this issue, educate the public, called a team of doctors, scientists, attorneys. Physician for Informed Consent was born. I have several other bios, but I'm not going to read them because we have a very important person on who will be discussing this. But Physician for Informed Consent is an agenda-driven organization. And their agenda-driven is that they just don't really give a rat's rear about the general public. They only care about them and their fundamental rights. And with that, we're joined by a panel, but right now we're going to bring in the person you're looking forward to listening to from Hawaii. It's a great place to state. Dr. Michael Patmos, who actually turned me on to this organization. I never heard of him before, who can give us a little bit more insight to the Physicians for Informed Consent, in my opinion, an agenda-driven organization. I don't know what you think of these people, but after going through all their CVs, I don't think very much. But, you may have a different opinion, Counselor.
Well, good morning, Nick, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to your audience. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you all. And aloha. It's very early here in Hawaii. But I hope everyone is doing well. I actually have a little upper respiratory viral infection. Just goes to show you that internal medicine doctors with added qualifications in infection control get sick too. Nevertheless, so Physicians for Informed Consent is a very interesting organization. I've debated with them quite a bit online, on LinkedIn, back and forth about some of their interpretation of the data. And I think I have a pretty good handle on this organization. First of all, to your point about their leadership, if you look at the website, there's a lot of folks involved with Physicians for Informed Consent. Many of them are not physicians at all. They have lawyers and other folks, nurses and so forth, and people from other walks of life who are not physicians, who are directors of the Physicians for Informed Consent. I think that's a little bit misleading right there. Of the physicians, nearly all of them are primary care doctors or non-infectious disease specialists. There is one infectious disease doctor listed on their board of directors whom I have reached out to multiple times, and I don't get a response. And I don't see any actual communication from that doctor in their official comments and so forth. So I'm not sure if that doctor is really actively involved in Physicians for Informed Consent or not. But suffice it to say, their leadership is mostly largely non-physician and certainly not infectious disease experts. So none of them are actually experts in matters of which they are opining as experts. So unless you're an clinical infectious disease doctor, you're not an expert in clinical infectious diseases. They're certainly entitled to their opinion. but it really can't be considered an expert opinion because it's not coming from a clinical infectious disease doctor. Only an oncologist can be an expert on oncology. Only a cardiologist can be an expert in cardiology. And only an infectious disease doctor is an expert in clinical infectious diseases. That's simply a matter of just pure, honest face fact. Now, in my debating with physicians for informed consent, they have a consistent pattern, what the messages they put out. They are very good. They're not dumb people. And the folks who do their research for them are really good. They will go through the literature and find one article. It may not be a very good article, but they'll find one article that they will then use to bolster their argument. Or they will take bona fide research and just place the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say you have a vaccine that is 99% effective. Whatever you want it to be effective, it's 99% effective. They will emphasize in their communication, did you know that this vaccine may not work for you? Well, it's true. For 1% of the people, it's not effective. So they emphasize the minority for whom it doesn't work, but they don't talk at all about the majority for whom it does work. This comes up a lot in their communication around measles. They talk about how measles is really largely a benign infection. 99% of people who get measles recover just fine. So that sounds pretty good. Only 1 in 1,000 people, die or have a terrible outcome. That's not that much. But a 0.1% bad outcome in a lot of people is still a big number. And, who cares if it's 0.1% if it's your child? So they don't, rarely do they outright lie, but what they do is they present kind of just a misleading interpretation of the data. And the sunlight is changing here on me. I'm sorry about that. They present very misleading interpretation of the data. They'll emphasize the negative and just ignore the positive. And when you debate with them, they're not amenable to really reviewing quality data from up to date or other sources. They don't really screen they don't really rely on high quality research or high quality data. Another example is they talked about how measles was going away anyway before the vaccine came out in 1952 or whatever, 53. So it really was unnecessary. And they cited a paper, an awful paper that was published in 1962 as proof. They said this argument is settled science. Measles was going away anyway. Well, I looked at the paper, the 1962 paper. It's a terrible paper. And it was citing data going back as far as 1912, saying that, reported cases. We didn't have any kind of organized statewide national report. There was no CDC back then. No one was actually collecting the data credibly. So to rely on a paper from 1962 that was in turn relying on lousy data from 1912 and say this represents settled science is ridiculous. So anyhow, that's the situation with when you're dealing with the Physicians for Informed Consent. They are agenda driven, and I think it's really interesting how it's a political organization. One of the physician directors is Dr. Jane Orient, who I've known her for years. She leads a sort of a group that is kind of a medical organization that resists all sorts of regulation of physicians. The physicians, I forget the name of it, but it's been around for a long time. They are opposed to board certification and all that sort of stuff. So it's a very political group. And there's real close coordination in the messaging. I don't know if you noticed this, but a couple of days ago, Rand Paul was on Fox News, and he was alleging there's this massive cover-up of COVID's origins. And within hours, Children's Health Defense had exactly the same content. So Physicians for Informed Consent, Children's Health Defense, Fox News, Trump, the GOP, their messaging is all highly coordinated and highly aligned. And it's not just in the United States. This is a global thing. Same thing's happening in the UK, elsewhere in Europe. This is part of a right-wing strategy to get back into power. The concept of medical freedom, stand up for your rights, resist. No one can tell you to be vaccinated. This resonates with the a hardcore Republican base. So this is really politics. It's not about science. It's really politics. And these physicians who are involved in this, some of them are passionate believers. They're deluded, but that's their problem. But many of them are politically motivated, and they are connected to the GOP and the Trump campaign. Trump has had some of these folks on the stage at CPAC. He has had some of these folks, clearly speaking on his behalf on Fox News and elsewhere. So what we're really seeing is the ugly side of what happens when politics jumps into the medical public health arena, and you have patients who are vulnerable to being manipulated with misleading information, and organizations that are very clever at just twisting the interpretation to sway the lay person. Did you know that the polio vaccine may not help you? It may not, but chances are 97% of the time it will.
And that is what the problem is. In other words, it's the misleading. We brought in Rick Rosner, who's a member of the Mega Society, and I've known of Rick way prior to him getting on Pod TV. But see, people don't even know what the Mega Society is, but I knew it through when I was a chess master. Of course, we studied what other people were doing, and people don't know the Mega Society is not MAGA. It's actually a high IQ group. You have to score, literally have to score one out of 1 million people.
MAGA, you have to have a low IQ.
Yeah, you got to answer incredibly ridiculous problems. It's just like watching trivia. A friend of mine, I used to play on his team. His name's Ken Jennings. He now obviously is very good, and I'm not. But we brought in Rick to get his opinion on this stuff. So, Rick, what are your thoughts about?
Well, I have a background in statistics, and to be a doctor, you don't have to know a lot about statistics. And yeah, the people who have these lunatic beliefs come to bad statistical conclusions. You saw this over and over again with COVID treatments. COVID, I think right now kills about 1 person in 400, say. So a doctor who's bad at statistics can treat 120 patients and nobody dies. And then that doctor says, well, I treated them with ivermectin. So ivermectin must be, there are a zillion drugs. There are probably 100 drugs that have been tried against COVID with some degree of success, just because COVID doesn't kill most people who get it. So that's thing one. Thing two is the measles vaccine. Vaccines have a certain amount of wiggle room in terms of herd immunity. If you can get 97% of people immunized, then measles has a hard time of getting a toehold in the population. And that's good because not every kid in a classroom can be immunized for medical reasons. Because they've got some kind of disease that either the vaccine doesn't work or it's dangerous for them. But then when you get lunatics dropping the percent vaccinated to 85%, then vaccine highly contagious, 15% unvaccinated in a classroom is 4 or 5 unvaccinated kids. That can spread, and then that spreads to the rest of the school, and then it spreads to home. I mean, we've had a pandemic. So, and measles is what, 5 times as contagious? I don't know the numbers, as contagious as COVID?
It's the most contagious virus we know of. It has an R naught of 12 to 18. That means every person infected with measles will infect, on average, 12 to 18 other people, who will in turn each infect 12 to 18 more. So you really get an exponential logarithmic explosion in cases. And we're seeing that now. The number of cases around the United States has jumped. We're now up to, I think, 119 as of yesterday, probably over 120 today. And you got to remember, measles was eradicated from the United States in 1999, but in the last few years, it's back.
Well, and the one thing with vax resistance is like COVID vax resistance is you see a lot of it with Trump people on the right, but general vax resistance, you can see it on the right with MAGA people, but you also see it from granola heads on the left.
Yeah, it's a terrific political strategy. Yeah, I can understand why Trump has decided to align with the anti-vax movement, and why they have RFK Jr. running as a spoiler. It's a very effective strategy, and I just hope to God it doesn't work, because he'll set back public health.
The more you learn about RFK Jr., the more he's a ridiculous lunatic. A guy, the guy doesn't like needles if they're vax needles, but he's okay if it's heroin or testosterone.
Yeah. Well, I didn't say that, but but we do have a very serious problem around the world now. We're seeing, I was thinking yesterday about where does this all end? And I think where it ends, where does the anti-vax movement end? They're so strong now and so well funded, and they have such a strong political base and an ally in the GOP. I think that they're going to continue to do what they do. And here's what will eventually happen. I'll make this prediction of medical futurism here. In the relative near future, in the next few years, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 years or less, sometime in the relative near future, we're going to see an explosion in the United States and in Europe. It's already started, of contagious infectious diseases that were long ago eradicated, that we haven't seen in years. They're going to come back, and people are going to be appalled when they see their children and their loved ones suffering as a result. And then I think eventually people will realize that they've been led astray.
But people will also take it for granted. I'm writing a novel set in the 2030s, and today you see TV ads featuring heavier and heavier people because 72% of Americans are overweight, and half of those are obese. So there are ads, especially for things like Ozempic, that show heavy people because it reflects a demographic trend. In my novel, you see people in everyday life walking around with oozy faces. It's like whatever disease, like they're dripping, they've got like swollen eyes, and eventually you start seeing those people in ads, the oozers and the drippers and the howlers, because we've just become accustomed to a big chunk of the population being chronically infected with something because we can't get our act together to believe in vaccinations anymore.
You just have to work in a hospital. Just do it's where I spent the last half century. Just spend time in a hospital and you'll see it. If you're not in a hospital working at the bedside, you don't know what you're talking about. So this is really an argument for clinicians who actively take care of real patients in real hospitals.
Yeah. Well, where do you see PIC going? In other words, the thing is, these groups that are very vocal, what the literature I've been reading is they're dangerous health of Americans. And
yeah, they are.
They
are.
I mean, we're just expanding.
They have very smart people behind them. They've got lawyers. They've got GOP money, and they're gonna, they're very clever. They know, they walk it right to the line. They're very careful. That you could say, well, yes, measles vaccine doesn't work 100% of the time. That's true. But it's the wrong, the emphasis is on the wrong syllable. It works 97% of the time, 98% of the time. That's the number to focus on. A bad doctor can lead a patient to any conclusion they want to lead them to. A bad doctor can convince a patient to have a procedure or not have a procedure, all depending upon how they twist the informed consent process. And in medical education, we do a lot to teach doctors how to present information in an unbiased, so they're not slanting the patient one way or the other. I think what Physicians for Informed Consent does is they slant and they present information in a way to lead their audience to an incorrect conclusion that these vaccines are dangerous or unsafe or ineffective, or that the disease wasn't very bad anyway. Polio wasn't that bad. Most people survived it. That's true. Most people survived polio. Most people survive measles, but not everyone does. And if it happens to be your child, it's a different story. Statistics don't matter when it's your child.
There's so much BS associated with VAERS, which that's where you report if somebody gets sick or injured after they've been vaccinated. Then it's supposed to be reported to a database. The database is supposed to look at patterns of sickness to see if maybe it's associated with the vaccine. But the idiots take VAERS and say, well, these people got vaccinated and then they died. But they don't do the math saying, well, yeah, what percentage of people die anyway without the vaccine?
That's a misuse of VAERS. If you look at the VAERS website, there's a disclaimer in bold language right at the top that said this information cannot be used in this way. It is unverifiable, coincidental, or otherwise cannot be established one way or the other. It's just raw sewage. Within that raw sewage, there may be an occasional observation. For example, myocarditis from the COVID vaccine, which is rare and generally mild, was first observed in VAERS. But it's sort of like a stream of raw sewage that within which there may be an occasional pearl. But it's 99% just self-reported garbage data. And they don't read the disclaimer. The disclaimer says right there on the VAERS website, this information cannot be used in this manner. It's unverifiable, unverified, coincidental, unreliable, self-reported, may be completely unrelated.
I'm gonna give you another
grumpy friend that I argue with on my show. He's always sending me papers from people who aren't qualified to write the papers.
Right. I'm going to give you another example. Reason why I say this group is an agenda driven. This comes from a hand surgeon. I'm sure a hand surgeon or a plastic surgeon is a expert in internal medicine. I'm positive about that. Right. Okay. Now, but here's a statement. You'll like this. This is on their website. A few years ago, I grew curious about the issue of vaccine safety when I noticed the degree of vitriol the topic would trigger in many physicians. In addition, doctors, quote, never seem to be able to back up their claims of vaccines being universally safe and effective. Now, we know there are studies on SSRN, which also Lancet is part of, that if this guy decides to pick up and read a study, he would find differently. But now, here's what he did. One of the first books I read on the subject was Dr. Suzanne Humphreys and Roman book, Dissolving Illusions. So he read one book. Every chess player knows if you're going to play chess, you need to read more than one book or you're kind of really bad. Okay. I was stunned to learn that death and morbidity from vaccines preventable infectious diseases plummeted prior to the advent of the respected vaccine programs. Unfortunately, I found many of the vaulted studies that underpin mandatory vaccine legislations are deeply flawed or even fraudulent. Okay.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about
Okay, so in a hospital, I spent my entire adult life working in hospitals. There's a thing called the organized medical staff. In the organized medical staff, physicians are allocated privileges and credentials based on their training. A hand surgeon is not going to do an infectious disease consult. An infectious disease doctor is not going to operate on your hand. We stay within our area we stay in our lane. We stay within our training. And when doctors stray outside of their training, it's a violation of medical staff bylaws. And it's also a violation of the state boards of medicine. You're required to stay within your training. It's not appropriate for a hand surgeon to opine as an expert about infectious disease, just as it's not appropriate for me as an internist to opine as an expert about hand surgery. We must defer to one another. And as far as there's no study that shows that vaccines are universally. There's no study that shows that any treatment medicine is universally safe or effective. Every single treatment has risk. Nothing works 100% of the time. That doesn't mean we don't do it. We'd stop everything. Then let's just all go home. We won't have any medical care at all because nothing works 100% of the time or is safe 100% of the time. There are people who don't survive an appendectomy. There are people who don't survive a tonsillectomy. So, we have to look at relative risks and benefits. And there's no question. The quality literature is clear. Vaccination is the single most effective public health strategy in the history of humanity. No other strategy has ever eliminated a disease from existence. Smallpox doesn't exist anymore in this world because we vaccinated everybody. If we could do that with polio and measles, we theoretically could eliminate those diseases as well. But we're going backward. We're sliding back to the Middle Ages because of the anti-vax movement. And they have been given a turbo boost by Dr. Donald Trump and his team of esteemed physicians, his sons and those others who are now driving this agenda in alliance with the anti-vax movement.
Also, vaccination has a history of like 300. George Washington required his troops to be vaccinated in 1780 against smallpox. It's well established practice and science.
Just goes to show that George Washington.
I always thought it was well established, and there wasn't anything. I didn't even know these crazies existed until Dr. Patmos introduced them to me. Then I realized not only do the crazies exist, they're all over the bloody internet, you know. And so I was shocked. But I'm just saying, as you go through their biographies, they all come in with an agenda. It's almost like if you want to be part of our group, you must have a crazy agenda. Then you can become part of our group. This is doctor number 2. I go to doctor number 3, and he attended it's like they attend one conference and all of a sudden they're convinced. Some guy gets up and speaks, or they read one book. I mean, they would be horrible playing chess, because I can tell you this: you read one book on the Neidorf, you are not an expert at chess by any stretch of the imagination. I have a stack of books you got to read, and you got to play. You got to be. You have to work really hard at it. You want to be an expert or a master, you can.
Also, doctors can go crazy. They can get senile. They can fall behind in knowledge. Like there are a couple like.
But this guy attended a conference called Defeat Autism Now, and then after attending the conference, he was totally convinced. He went to one conference, totally convinced that vaccines create autism, and I'm sitting there going, "How could he be? How could he be that stupid?"
The culprit, the supposed culprit, is a mercury-based preservative in vaccines, except that stuff hasn't been used in most U.S. vaccines in 20 years.
So the published literature is like theirs. It's a stream of potential effluent. And just because something is published in a medical journal doesn't mean it's correct. What doctors do is we don't just read and accept something because it's in a medical journal. We rely on, in medical education, every medical school in the country, every teaching hospital in the country relies on a tool called UpToDate. UpToDate is the premier online clinical decision research tool used around the world. And they filter the data using critical appraisal methods, and they screen out all the junk, and what's left behind it's like decanting wine. What's left behind is the good stuff. So that's what doctors use, and that's what everybody needs to use. You can't just say, well, I saw an article in a journal and it said that, it just said something. That doesn't mean it's right. You have to use UpToDate. If you're not using UpToDate, you're just not up to date, and you're at risk of citing bad science in junk papers published in pay to publish lousy, they call them throwaway medical journals. And Physicians for Informed Consent likes to cite that kind of data, those kind of studies.
Yeah. And then the last one, by the way, you could read through all of them. You can find this stuff behind them. It's really sad commentary. That these people actually got medical degrees and are practicing. That to me is the spooky thing. But in 2008, when my entire family got sick from the flu vaccine for the 3rd year in a row, I decided to do research. And after doing the research, she is no longer indoctrinated that vaccines are safe and effective, because her family got sick even though they took the flu vaccine.
Okay.
I'm going like, are you? I know that if you take a flu vaccine, it's not 100% that you're going to not get the flu.
There's one more thing that people do. They exaggerate their credentials.
Well, is that for sure?
He'll be on the show shortly.
I've had this conversation with patients a million times over the last 50 years. So when do you give the flu shot? You give the flu shot October, November, December. When's the cold season? October, November, December. So people get a flu shot. The next week they have a head cold. A head cold is not influenza, but they link those two. Association is not causation. If you gave the flu shot on July 4th, people would say the next day there was fireworks. Obviously, it must be a relationship there.
But that is exactly what they're doing.
Yes, it is.
You know,
Sixth grade,
I
sixth
took my
grade
flu
science.
shot on July 3rd, and July 4th there's fireworks.
Yeah.
Hence, the
Had
flu
to be
shot
related.
creates fireworks.
Did you know that almost everybody who dies is wearing underwear? Obviously, underwear is lethal.
Right, exactly, and that's exactly what they're doing. It
So
just drives
this
me.
is sixth grade science that they're
Right.
somebody was out sick that day in sixth grade.
Yeah, I mean, it drives me nuts. But the thing is that they have a whole organization based on this, and we're at the time. But we do want to thank Dr. Michael Patmos, who is board certified in internal medicine. Make sure I get that one right. And that finally we have somebody who has some knowledge as opposed to looking at some of this other stuff that's out there, which is to me obviously a scam and misleading. But then there are a lot of people that will look at us just like these people did. He said he read one book and all of a sudden he changed his mind. He went to one conference, all of a sudden, boy, and he didn't look at a lot of data. It just went one thing, and then all of a sudden it was done. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you our audience in the United States and of course from around the world, medicine and science with Dr. Michael Patmos.
Aloha.
Bye-bye.